Mira stood at the small window of her room, looking out at the silver curve of the moon's surface. Dome 1 was always quiet in the early morning. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, still unsure if she had made the right decision. Her younger sister Lena had called her the night before with a stuffy nose and a desperate voice. "Please, Mira," Lena had said, coughing between words. "It's just for one day. The boy is nice, his dad is quiet. I'm really sick and I can't go." Mira worked in the old lunar library as an archivist. She loved her books, old Earth literature, and the peaceful silence of her workspace. She didn't know much about kids, and she definitely didn't know anything about being a nanny. But Lena had never asked her for anything this big before. So now, here she was, riding a small rover through the tunnels connecting the moon's living domes. The client lived in Dome 3, one of the private residential domes. Mira had never been there before. Most of the people who lived in Dome 3 were rich. Very rich. She adjusted her scarf and looked down at her bag. She had only brought a notebook, a digital reader, and a lunchbox with fruit. The rover came to a gentle stop at a large, clear gate. A voice spoke softly through the speaker. "Visitor 4. Unit 8A. Name, please?" "Mira," she answered, suddenly nervous. "I'm replacing Lena for today." "Confirmed. Please proceed." The gate opened without sound, and Mira stepped out. The air was warm, controlled by indoor systems. She followed the path toward a large, silver-gray house with smooth walls and a glowing green roof. The door opened before she could knock. A small boy stood there, maybe 5 years old. He had big, curious eyes and dark hair that flopped over one side. He looked at her for a moment, then smiled. "You're not Lena." Mira smiled back. "No, I'm her sister. My name is Mira." "I'm Tommy," the boy said proudly. "Come." And the house was quiet, but full of life. Soft music played in the background, something gentle, maybe classical. The floor was warm under her shoes, and the walls had moving images of forests and rivers. Mira paused as a small silver bot floated past her, holding a tray with juice and toast. Tommy took her hand. "Want to see my spaceship?" Mira laughed gently. "You have a spaceship?" "Well, not a real one, but I built one in my room." He led her down a clean hallway to a bright room filled with glowing toys, small tools, and floating model planets. On one side, a plastic space station was connected with wires and blinking lights. Mira knelt down. "You made all this?" "Dad helped," Tommy said. "But I did most of it." Before she could ask more, a quiet voice came from the door. "He did." Mira turned and saw a man standing there. He looked to be in his mid-30s. He wore a simple sweater and dark pants. His face was calm, with kind eyes and a thoughtful expression. "You must be Mira," he said. "Thank you for helping Lena today." She stood quickly. "Yes, just for today. Lena said it was important." "I hope I'm not." "You're fine," he said gently. "I'm Dan. Just treat Tommy kindly. He likes stories." Mira relaxed it. "Little, I can do that," Dan nodded. "I have some work in the back lab. If you need anything, just ask the house system." Then he turned and left, leaving Mira and Tommy to begin their day. The morning passed in a blur. Tommy showed her his books. All of them were about stars, aliens, and earth animals. They sat in the garden dome, which surprised Mira. It had real grass, real flowers, and even a tree. How could someone afford a real tree on the moon? Tommy handed her a small ball. "Throw it. It floats slow here." She did, and the ball hovered in the low gravity, spinning gently. They laughed together, and for a moment, Mira forgot she was just a visitor. At lunch, the housebot served fruit sandwiches and warm soup. Mira was impressed with how smoothly everything worked. The kitchen cleaned itself. The lights changed color with the time of day. The robot even read a short poem. Before serving dessert, Tommy asked, "Do you like space?" Mira nodded. "Yes, But I like stories about people in space more than space itself. Me too, he said. Dad says humans are the best story makers, she smiled. He's right. Later, while Tommy napped, Mira walked around the house. Quietly, she didn't open doors, but she did notice the walls were lined with books. Real books. Some looked like old Earth prints, the kind collectors paid fortunes for. One caught her eye, a signed copy of First Contact, The Day We Listened. It was a famous book about the first peaceful meeting between humans and an alien race called the Chiron. She stared at the signature, Daniel R. Hawley. She turned and looked toward the hallway where Dan had gone earlier. Could it be the same man? Daniel Hawley, the engineer, who helped translate the Chiron signals and created the energy-sharing grid that powered half the moon now. That Dan. She stepped back, heart beating faster. No wonder he had real trees. No wonder the bots were custom-made. She had walked into the house of a quiet, kind, and incredibly brilliant man, who just happened to be one of the most respected engineers in the system. And he was hiding in a quiet dome with his son, drinking soup and reading stories. Mira sat down slowly. She had only agreed to cover the job for one day, but something told her this was not going to be just one ordinary day. Mira sat in the quiet living room, her thoughts still spinning. She kept looking at the book on the shelf, First Contact, The Day We Listened. It was real. The name on the cover was Daniel R. Hawley, the same name as Tommy's dad. There was no doubt now. Dan was the same person who helped build the human Chiron energy system. She looked around the house with new eyes. Everything made sense now. The peaceful home, the advanced bots, the garden dome, even the way Tommy spoke like a small scientist. Dan didn't just have money, he had a brilliant mind, and yet he didn't act important. He wore a simple sweater, made soup for lunch, and let his son play with drones in the backyard. Mira found it strange and kind of wonderful. Tommy woke from his nap and came running into the living room. "Can we build something?" he asked with excitement. "Sure." Mira said, "What do you want to build?" "A space bridge," he said, holding up a box of magnetic blocks. She laughed. "All right, let's do it." They sat on the soft carpet and started connecting the blocks. Mira listened as Tommy explained how the bridge would help aliens and humans travel to each other's planets. "My dad says bridges are better than walls," Tommy said proudly. "He's right," Mira said softly. As they played, Mira heard footsteps. Dan walked in, holding a tablet. He stopped for a moment when he saw the two of them working on the block structure. "That's a good design," he said. "Tommy planned it," Myra replied. Dan smiled and sat on the edge of the couch. "He always builds with purpose. Not just for fun." "That's rare." Mira looked at him. "He's thoughtful." Dan nodded. "Thank you for watching him today. I didn't want to cancel my work. It's a special project." Mira hesitated, then asked, "Is it about energy systems?" Dan raised his eyebrows slightly. "You know who I am." "I saw your book," she said gently. "I read it a few years ago." Dan sighed but didn't seem upset. "Most people forget or don't notice. It's been quiet since I left public." "Work? Why did you leave?" she asked. He looked at Tommy, who was now busy adjusting the bridge's support columns. Then Dan answered, "After the peace agreement with the Chiron, everything changed. Big companies wanted to control the energy flow. I wanted to share it. I didn't like the pressure. So I walked away." "That must have been hard." "It was," Dan said, "but I had Tommy and peace of mind." Mira felt a quiet respect grow in her heart. Dan was not just smart, he was brave. He gave up power to protect something more important. Later that afternoon, Mira helped Tommy water the plants in the garden dome. The tree in the center was tall and leafy, with roots growing in soft lunar soil. "Do trees miss Earth?" Tommy asked. Mira smiled. "Maybe, but this one looks happy." Tommy pointed at a small flower growing at the base of the tree. "That one is new. It wasn't there yesterday. Mira bent down to look. The flower had purple petals and glowed slightly. It didn't look like an earth plant. That's strange, she said. Where did it come from? Before Tommy could answer, Dan's voice came from behind them. That one came from Kuroa, he said. It was a gift, Mira turned. It's beautiful, Dan nodded. They call it a memory bloom. It only grows in places that feel peaceful. Mira looked at the flower again, feeling something warm in her chest. This home, simple, quiet, and full of love, had something special. Maybe even magical. As the sun lamps dimmed to simulate evening, Dan invited Mira to stay for dinner. You've already spent most of the day here, he said. And the rover schedule is delayed until the next hour, Mira agreed. She wasn't in a hurry to leave. They sat at the kitchen table, eating a light meal made by the housebot. Warm rice, green vegetables, and soft fruit bread. Tommy talked about his space bridge, and Dan listened with care, asking good questions. Mira noticed how close the father and son were. Dan didn't just take care of Tommy, he respected him. He listened. He guided him with patience. After dinner, Dan cleaned up while Mira read Tommy a story. It was an old earth tale about a fox and a traveler. Tommy leaned on her arm, sleepy but smiling. By the time Dan returned, Tommy had dozed off. I'll put him to bed, Dan whispered. Mira stood quietly and followed him to the hallway. As Dan carried Tommy to his room, Mira glanced once more at the book on the shelf, the flower in the garden, the warm light of the home. She had come for one day. Just one, but something inside her told her this wasn't the end. When Dan returned, he looked a little tired but calm. Thank you again, Mira, he said. You're welcome, she replied. Then, gathering her courage, she added, Today felt different. I didn't expect it, but I enjoyed it. Dan gave a small smile. Sometimes the best things happen when we don't expect them. She nodded. Your house is full of life. Not just machines or systems. It feels human. That's what I'm working on, he said. Mira tilted her head. What do you mean? Dan hesitated, then said, I'll show you tomorrow if you're free. Mira blinked. Tomorrow? You don't have to, but I think you might understand what I'm building. Mira paused, then smiled. I'd like that. The next morning, Mira woke up earlier than usual. She stood by her small window, watching the light rise inside Dome 1. Artificial sunlight slowly brightened the white buildings, and the lunar dust outside sparkled like frost. Her heart beat faster than normal, not with fear, but with curiosity. She was going back to Dan's house, back to the quiet home in Dome 3, back to see the man who had once helped unite two worlds, and now chose to raise a boy and grow a tree in peace. She told herself it was just to return the scarf she had accidentally left behind. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The ride to Dome 3 felt shorter than yesterday. The rover slid through the smooth tunnel, humming gently as it moved. When she arrived at the gate, the house system already recognized her. Welcome back, Mira. That made her smile. As she stepped through the soft front entrance, Tommy ran up to her with excitement. You came back. I told you I forgot my scarf, Mira said, laughing. Tommy hugged her quickly, then pulled her hand. Come see my robot. I gave it new arms. Dan appeared behind them, smiling calmly. He looked rested and comfortable in another soft sweater. You're really early, he said. I didn't want to interrupt, Mira said. You're not, Dan replied. Actually, I was hoping you'd come. Mira tilted her head. Why? Dan looked toward the hallway leading to the back of the house. Because I want to show you what I've been working on. Mira followed Dan through a quiet passage. She hadn't been down yesterday. The hallway had smooth walls and soft blue lights. At the end was a wide glass door that opened with a soft chime. Inside, the room looked like a peaceful lab. No wires on the floor, no loud machines. It was quiet, like a science garden. In the center stood a silver capsule the size of a closet. Next to it was a clear panel filled with moving lights and soft holograms. On one side, a series of small plants grew in a light-controlled case. Mira walked in slowly. "What is all this?" she asked. Dan stood beside the capsule. "This is the first model of something I call a life pod." Mira looked closer. The pod had soft edges, not sharp ones. Its surface looked alive, like it could adapt or breathe. "What does it do?" Dan folded his arms and spoke with the quiet tone of a teacher. "It's a small, self-sustaining unit. If it works, it could help grow food, create air, and store energy on any new planet or moon." Mira's eyes widened. "It's like a home for life?" "Exactly," Dan nodded. "It's not just for humans. It could work for any species. All it needs is light, a bit of water, and a story." Mira blinked. "A story?" Dan walked over to a second table where a small cube was glowing. "This is the part that isn't finished yet. The heart of the pod is not made of code. It needs something human, something emotional." Mira stepped closer. "You mean, not just instructions or rules?" Dan nodded. "Right. AI can solve problems, but it doesn't always understand why we care, why we protect, why we explore. That's what I need help with." Mira looked at the cube. She could see layers of data moving inside it, but it didn't feel cold like most machines. It felt like it was listening. "You want to teach it to feel?" "Not exactly," Dan said. "I want it to remember what makes life meaningful. Not just survive, but live." Mira took a long breath. "That's beautiful, but why me?" Dan looked her in the eyes. "Because yesterday, I saw how you talked to Tommy, the way you listened, the way you told stories. That's what the pod needs. A human heart, not a perfect one, just a real one." Mira blushed slightly. "I'm just a librarian," Dan smiled. "And I'm just an engineer. But we both understand something important, that life isn't made of just metal and rules. It's made of connection." They spent the next few hours sitting at a soft desk beside the pod. Dan showed her how the story core worked. It used old Earth books, children's stories, personal memories, and emotions to teach the pod how to react in difficult situations. Together, they picked a short tale, The Seed and the Star, a peaceful story about a tiny seed that travels through space looking for a home. Mira read it out loud, and the story core recorded her voice, her tone, and even her small laugh at the funny parts. She noticed Dan watching her quietly, as if every word she spoke added color to the lab. When she finished, the cube blinked softly. Then it spoke, not in a robotic voice, but in a soft tone like a child's. "Home is not a place. It's a feeling." Myra's eyes widened. Dan's voice was soft. "It's working." They had lunch again with Tommy. The boy was happy to show Myra his new robot arms, made from kitchen spoons and light strips. Dan watched quietly, eating slowly, and smiling when Mira made Tommy laugh. The house felt even warmer than the day before. After lunch, Mira helped Tommy build a new puzzle while Dan returned to the lab. The boy looked up at her and said, "I'm glad you came back." "Me too," she said gently. Tommy paused. "Do you like it here?" Myra nodded. "Very much," Tommy smiled. "Then you should stay," she chuckled. "I can't just stay forever." "Why not?" Tommy asked simply. "You're nice. You help my dad smile." Mira looked away for a second, her cheeks warming. When she left that evening, Dan walked her to the rover station. Before she stepped in, he spoke softly. "Mira, would you consider helping me with the project? I can pay you, of course. But more than that, I think you're the missing part." She looked at him, surprised. "You're serious?" "I wouldn't ask if I wasn't." She took a deep breath. "I'll come tomorrow," she said. Dan smiled. "Good." As the rover moved back toward Dome 1, Mira placed her hand over her bag. Inside it, A small copy of The Seed in the Star. Dan had given it to her. The moon outside was cold and gray. But inside her heart, something new was growing. A quiet connection, a strange offer, and maybe a beginning she never expected. The next morning, Mira stepped out of the rover in Dome 3 with steady steps and a curious heart. She wasn't just visiting today, she was starting something. She had accepted Dan's offer. She would help him teach the life pod how to feel. As she walked toward the silver house, the glass walls reflected the gentle glow of the dome's morning light. Flowers in the garden swayed slightly under the warm air systems, and a pair of floating houseboats glided past her. Before she could knock, the door opened automatically. "Good morning, Mira," the house said in a friendly voice. Mira smiled. "Good morning." Inside, Tommy was already playing near the window with a model of Saturn. He waved at her. "Mira." "I made a space station with donuts," she laughed. "That sounds delicious and smart." Dan entered from the hallway, holding a tablet and a steaming mug. "You're right on time." Mira adjusted the strap of her shoulder bag. "I brought some old storybooks from the library. They're digital copies, but they have heart." Dan nodded. "Perfect. Let's go to the workshop." Inside the quiet lab room, Mira felt like she was entering another world again. The life pod still stood in the center, silver and soft, glowing faintly from within. Around it, new panels had been added. The memory bloom from Kiroa had been moved here too, growing under a focused light. Dan pulled out a chair for her and tapped the table screen. A set of soft lights lit up the surface, displaying the pod's core system. "We finished recording your story yesterday," he said. "But now I want to try something deeper, something personal." Mira sat carefully. "You want a memory?" "Only if you're comfortable," Dan replied. "We're testing how emotional energy helps the pod respond to real situations." Mira looked at the silver cube again. "What kind of memory?" "Something simple. Not sad, just real." She thought for a moment. Then she smiled. "I have one." She leaned forward, speaking clearly and slowly. "When I was 8, I planted a tiny seed on our balcony in Dome 1. Just one. I didn't expect it to grow. Moon has no soil, but I took care of it, watered it, talked to it. Every morning, I checked on it. One day, a green leaf came out. I was so happy I cried. My father said, 'It's not just a plant. It's your friend now.'" The cube pulsed gently as she spoke. When she finished, the pod gave off a soft hum. Dan typed on the tablet, checking the results. "It responded to your voice pattern and heart rate. That story gave it warmth." Mira looked surprised. "Warmth?" Dan explained, "The pod has no heart. But through these stories, it can form a type of empathy. It doesn't understand pain or joy like we do, but it learns how humans choose." He turned the screen to show a test result. Emotional stability. 23%. Below it, response rate, gentle, tone, comfort, decision tendency. Protect. Mira stared at the words. "That's amazing." Dan smiled quietly. "It's working." They spent the rest of the day feeding more small stories into the pod. Mira read tales of kindness, patience, and courage. Not grand adventures, but simple moments. Dan explained how the pod would use these to make choices if it ever had to help a living being on another world. "It's not just a machine," Dan said. "It's a guardian." At one point, Tommy entered the lab holding a soft blanket. "Dad," he said, "can my blanket go in the pod?" Dan raised an eyebrow. "Your blanket? It makes me feel safe," Tommy said seriously. "Maybe it will help the pod feel safe too." Mira smiled warmly. Dan bent down. "That's a very good idea." He opened a small compartment at the bottom of the pod, designed for keepsakes. Carefully, he placed the soft blue blanket inside. "Now," Dan said, "the pod has part of your story too." Tommy grinned. "It's ready for space now." Later that evening, while Tommy played in his room, Mira and Dan sat in the quiet garden dome. The tree above them rustled gently, touched by the artificial wind. The purple memory bloom swayed softly near the roots. Dan leaned back on the bench. "You've changed the way I work, Mira." She looked at him, surprised. "Me? You brought something I lost," he said simply. A human voice. "I forgot how much it matters." Mira felt her heart flutter. "You didn't forget. You just turned the volume down." He looked at her with kind eyes. "Thank you for turning it back up." She looked down, smiling. A pause. Then she asked, "Dan, if this pod works, what happens next?" He looked at the tree. "Then I send it." "Where?" He turned to her. "Europa, one of Jupiter's moons. A safe zone was set up last year. No life lives there yet. If the pod can survive and grow, it means humans can begin new chapters, peacefully, softly, not by force, but by presence." Mira whispered, "Like planting a garden in the stars." Dan nodded, "Exactly." As the day ended, Dan walked her to the rover gate again. This time they didn't say much. But just before she stepped inside, Mira turned and asked quietly, "Can I come again tomorrow?" Dan's answer was simple, "I'd like that." Back in her room in Dome 1, Mira sat by her window, holding a small flower seed she had kept in a drawer for years. She looked at the moonlight above, then down at the soil pod by her shelf. Gently she planted the seed and whispered, "Let's grow again." Something in her life was blooming, not fast, not loud, but real. And maybe, just maybe, the stars were listening too. 3 days had passed since Mira started working with Dan in the lab. Each day felt more special than the one before. She no longer came just to return a scarf or help with stories. She came because she felt like she belonged there with Tommy's laughter, with the gentle hum of the life pod, and with Dan's quiet voice explaining something new every day. That morning, when she entered the house, she found Dan already waiting in the garden dome. He was standing near the tree, holding a small silver tablet and looking thoughtful. Mira walked closer. "Good morning." Dan turned and smiled. "Good morning. I was just thinking, today might be the right time." "For what?" she asked. "For the first real test," he said. "The pod is ready." Mira's heart beat faster. "The test? Like a live simulation?" Dan nodded. "Yes, we'll place it in a sealed environment. The system will simulate a distant moon's atmosphere, light levels, and energy flow. If the pod can create its own air, grow a seed, and respond gently to changes, then it's ready for launch." She looked at the pod through the glass window. "Of the lab, do you think it'll work?" Dan's answer was soft but sure. "I hope so. With your stories, it's stronger now, more balanced." Together, they entered the lab. The life pod glowed gently, like it was breathing. The memory bloom inside the glass case had opened 2 more petals. Even the blanket Tommy had placed inside looked peaceful, resting in the keepsake compartment. Dan tapped a few keys on the main screen. "The pod will be placed in the sealed chamber for 3 hours. Light, heat, pressure, and minor emotional tests will run during that time." Mira raised an eyebrow. "Emotional tests?" "Yes," Dan said. "We simulate small conflicts, like an object falling or a sudden sound, to see how the pod reacts. Does it protect? Does it freeze? Does it comfort?" Mira nodded slowly, like a person learning how to care. Dan added, "It's not just about surviving on a new world. It's about helping other life survive, gently." The pod was carefully lifted and placed inside the clear chamber. Dan sealed it with a soft beep, and the room lights dimmed as the simulation began. On the screen, Mira saw readings for temperature, gravity pressure, and life signals. Everything looked good. Dan stepped back. "Now we wait." They sat together at the table, drinking tea from clear cups. The silence between them was comfortable. "Dan," Mira asked after a moment, "why are you doing this alone?" You could work with a full team or a big company. Dan looked thoughtful. Because companies want control. They want to sell this. I don't. I want to give it. Give it? Mira asked, surprised. Dan nodded. 1 pod, 1 moon. 1. Peaceful act. No noise, no fame, just something real. Something that proves humans can grow life, not just take it. Mira stared at him with quiet admiration. That's why you're different. He gave a small smile. That's why I needed you. After 1 hour, the first test ended. The pod passed. It created breathable air and grew a soft green leaf under the simulated light. The system beeped gently. Growth mode stable. Mira clapped her hands softly. It's alive, Dan smiled. It's beginning. In the second hour, a small object fell near the pod, part of the test. The pod reacted by extending the soft shield around the sprout and releasing a calming hum. The screen showed protective response, gentle, delay, 0.2 seconds. Mira whispered, it's learning to care. Dan nodded. During the final hour, the simulation introduced a sudden drop in temperature, not dangerous, just enough to confuse a regular machine. The pod paused. Then, slowly, it wrapped a light layer of thermal fabric, inspired by Tommy's blanket, around the sprout. Then it whispered something. Mira leaned closer. Did it just speak? Dan replayed the audio. The voice was soft, and it spoke Mira's own words from the story she told earlier. You're safe now. I'm here. Mira felt a chill, not from cold, but from wonder. Dan looked at her. It remembered not just the story, but the feeling. When the test ended, the pod was removed from the chamber. It was glowing softly, the leaf inside now stronger, taller, and greener. Dan checked the data one last time. It passed. All of it. Mira clapped her hands again, and this time Dan laughed gently. You did it, she said. No, Dan replied. We did it. Tommy came into the lab just as they were finishing. Did the pod work? He asked. Mira knelt beside him. It did. Your blanket helped it feel safe. Tommy grinned. Told you. Dan ruffled his son's hair. We'll prepare to send it to Europa next week. Tommy's eyes widened. To space? Dan nodded. It'll be the first soft voice on another world. That night, Mira sat again in the garden dome with Dan. The stars above the dome ceiling twinkled gently, like a quiet promise. Dan, she said softly, what happens after the launch? He looked up. If it works, the pod will send signals back. If the plant survives for 30 days, then we'll know life can begin there. Mira asked, and for us? What happens here? Dan looked at her, his eyes calm. I'm not sure yet. But I know this. I want to keep building, not just pods, but a life, something real. Mira's voice was gentle. So do I. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. Above them, the stars blinked. Inside the lab, a pod gently glowed. And in both their hearts, something new had taken root, soft, quiet, and full of promise. 1 week later, the life pod was ready for its journey. Mira stood next to Dan in the launch room, which was much smaller than she had imagined. There were no giant buttons or loud machines. Just a quiet control desk, a viewing screen, and the pod sitting safely inside a silver crate, glowing faintly from within. Dan checked the screen again. Final systems, green. Signal strength, steady, we're ready. Mira nodded, her heart beating faster. It feels strange. Sending it away, Dan looked at her. It's not goodbye. The pod will send us messages. We'll know how it's doing every day. Tommy came running in, holding a small paper he had drawn. I made this for the pod. Mira bent down to see it. The picture showed a tiny pod standing on a rocky moon, with flowers blooming all around it. There was even a smiling sun in the corner. Dan smiled. Let's scan it and upload it. The pod will carry your drawing in its memory. Tommy cheered. Now it won't be alone. The launch was smooth and quiet. A small rocket from the private port carried the pod out of the dome into space. No reporters, no big announcements. Just a quiet beginning. After it disappeared into the sky, Mira and Dan sat outside on the garden bench. The tree above them swayed in the soft air, and the memory bloom glowed gently. "I can't believe it," Mira whispered. "It's really gone," Dan nodded. "It started its journey." She looked at him. "You're calm." "I've done all I can," he said. "Now we wait and hope." Mira watched the soft stars on the dome ceiling. She felt proud and also curious. "What if it works?" she asked. "What happens if the pod survives, if it grows?" Dan looked thoughtful. "Then we tell no one. At least not at first." She blinked. "What do you mean?" He turned toward her. "Mira, the world moves fast. When people hear about success, they rush to copy it, sell it, or control it. But this pod is different. It's not just technology, it's kindness in a shell. It must grow slowly, quietly. Like trust," Myra understood. "So we wait. Just like we waited for the flower to bloom." Dan smiled softly. "Exactly." 2 days later, everything changed. While Mira was reading with Tommy in the garden dome, Dan came running in, holding his tablet, his face serious. "We have a problem," he said. Mira stood quickly. "What happened?" Dan showed her the screen. A signal from the pod was blinking, strong and clear. But next to it, another signal had appeared, from space. Unknown origin, unknown source. A foreign drone? She asked. "Possibly," Dan said, "but not Earth-made." Mira's eyes widened. "You mean," Dan nodded, "it's Chiron, the alien species that had first shared peaceful contact with humans over a decade ago. They were known for their quiet nature, advanced sensing, and respect for balance. They didn't interfere unless they saw something meaningful. They found the pod?" Mira whispered. Dan sat down, still looking at the screen. They noticed the signal. "It's small, but emotional waves travel differently. The pod's story data, your voice, Tommy's drawing, the feelings inside, caught their attention." Mira was silent for a moment. Then she asked, "Is that bad?" "No," Dan said, "but it means we can't stay hidden anymore." That evening, a message arrived. A soft hologram appeared in the lab, showing a peaceful Chiron diplomat. It looked like a tall, glowing figure with long arms, soft blue eyes, and a slow, warm voice. "We sensed a quiet creation," the voice said. "One that carries not logic, but love. Who made this?" Dan stepped forward. "I did, but not alone." Mira stood beside him. The Chiron diplomat tilted its head. "Why was it sent alone into the stars?" Dan answered calmly. "Because peace doesn't need a parade." There was a pause. Then the Chiron responded, "We understand. We wish to learn more. May we visit?" Dan looked at Mira, surprised. She nodded slowly. "They deserve to see what we've built." The next day, 3 Chiron guests arrived quietly at Dome 3. They did not bring ships or guards, only soft light tools and peaceful energy. Tommy was amazed. "They glow." Mira smiled. "Yes, they do." Dan welcomed them inside and showed them the lab. The Chirons moved slowly, calmly, touching nothing, but observing everything. When they saw the memory bloom in the glass case, they hummed softly. One of them said, "It grew more petals. That means peace lives here." Mira explained the stories, how the pod had learned from her words, from Tommy's kindness and from Dan's vision. The lead Chiron bowed gently. "You have given life a voice." Dan asked, "Will you stop us?" The Chiron replied, "No, we will watch. And if it grows, we will protect it." That night, after the guests had left, Mira and Dan stood in the lab together. It was quiet again, but not empty. They didn't ask for blueprints. Mira said. Dan nodded. Because they know something better than plans, she smiled. What? Trust. He answered. Before leaving for the night, Mira bent down near the memory bloom. She whispered, "Thank you." Then, to her surprise, the flower glowed a little brighter. A new petal unfolded. She looked at Dan wide-eyed. He chuckled softly. Looks like it listened. As she walked back to the rover, Tommy ran after her. With his arms open, "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked. Mira knelt beside him. "Always." He hugged her tightly. "You're part of the story now." She held him close and smiled. "Yes, I am." And as the rover doors closed behind her, Mira looked up at the stars beyond the dome's glass. The same stars the pod now floated under, carrying a small blanket, a child's drawing, and the voice of a librarian who came just for one day and stayed to change everything. The days passed slowly but filled with quiet hope. Mira had become part of something she never expected, a project that was more than technology. It was life, growing softly under the stars. Dan, Tommy, and Mira spent long hours together. The Life Pod was still orbiting Europa, sending daily messages of growth, warmth, and safety. One evening, Mira sat beside Dan in the garden dome. The moonlight filtered through the glass ceiling, and the memory bloom glowed softly. "I never thought one day as a nanny could change my life," Mira said quietly. Dan smiled. "Neither did I, but sometimes the smallest choices grow the biggest stories." She looked at him. "What happens next?" "After the pod?" Dan's eyes shone softly. "We keep building. We keep growing. This is only the beginning." Suddenly, the house system beeped softly. Dan checked the screen. "It's the pod," he said. It sent a new message. Mira watched as the screen showed a soft video. The pod floated above Europa's rocky surface, its leaf glowing bright green. Slowly, a tiny flower bloomed next to the sprout. The memory bloom was alive. Tommy clapped his hands. "It's a garden." Dan nodded. "A small one, but real." Mira felt tears in her eyes. "We did it." Weeks passed. More pods were quietly sent to other moons and planets. Each carried stories of kindness, of hope, of human heart. Mira's life changed too. She left the library job and began helping Dan full-time. Together, they traveled to talk quietly with scientists and dreamers who believed in peace. Tommy grew happier too. His space bridges grew bigger, and his curiosity never ended. One day, Mira asked Dan, "Do you think the world will ever be ready for this?" Dan thought, "Maybe, but for now it's enough to plant seeds and wait. The stars are patient." On a calm night, Mira and Dan stood outside the dome. The sky was full of stars, bright and endless. "Thank you," Dan said softly. "For what?" Mira asked. "For believing, for staying." She smiled. "I never imagined one day could lead to this." Dan looked at the stars. "Neither did I. But now I know the future is full of stories waiting to grow." Mira looked up and whispered, "And we're just getting started." The quiet house in Dome 3 was no longer just a home. It was a place where hope lived, where stories grew into life, and where a small nanny who came for one day found a new family, a new purpose. And somewhere out there, the life pod bloomed. Gently on Europa, carrying a child's drawing, a soft blanket, and the heart of a human who chose to believe.